Hello and welcome to the Film Comment Podcast. My name is Violet Lucca and I'm the digital editor. In the January-February issue of the magazine, the critic Molly Haskell interviews Annette Bening about her latest film, 20th Century Women. Haskell makes a fascinating observation to kick off the interview. Quote, "I was looking at these films from the early 70s. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, A Woman Under the Influence, films about women being torn and not knowing how to negotiate their lives. Somehow, 20th Century Women is the great film of that era, you know?" End quote. To expand on this idea, I brought together Haskell and Margaret Barton-Fumo for a discussion about female writers, directors, and actresses of New Hollywood. It wasn't comprehensive, but how could it be? I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Hello and welcome to the Film Comment Podcast. My name's Violet Lucca. I'm the digital editor, and today I'm joined by
Molly Haskell.
Margaret Barton-Fumo, longtime contributor to Film Comment.
So today we're going to be talking about, typically New Hollywood is thought of as this very masculine time. And in many ways it was, because who were the movie brats, this young crop of go-getting young men who rose up through either, Roger Corman or these other film schools and got to make these great American narratives that were recycling old genre tropes from the 30s, 40s, and just really trailblazing men. But there were a lot of women and women's stories that were really dealing with what it meant to be a woman and living through second wave feminism, where it's like, who am I now? If I am a wife, what does that mean? If I am going to be a career woman, what does that mean? And Molly, you've written a bit about this, sort of like the neo-women's film, of the 1970s. So
yeah, right. Well, it was a period after the feminine mystique when feminism was very much in the upsurge, but it hadn't really been clarified. I mean, careers, we didn't think in terms of careers that much. I mean, we did. It was a dream, but it wasn't like, what is your career going to be? Most people got out of college and got married. So here you had these films, they were very much about, I also called it like the domestic refusenik or the mad housewife film, because you had Diary of a Mad Housewife, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Clute, A Woman Under the Influence, Play It As It Lays, Coppola's The Rain People, which is sort of forgotten. Another thing you had in these male sort of golden era movies was the road trips. Guys were always going on road trips. They wanted to be alone. They were fleeing whatever, women or domesticity. Rarely did you have a woman. It just wasn't done. A woman's place was in the home. But in The Rain People, you have Shirley Knight just walking out on her marriage because she's pregnant and she's suddenly thinking, is this all there is? Is this what it's all about? And of course, Clute is the Jane Fonda being a prostitute, because thereby she can control her life and she can play as an object without being an object. And Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, where Ellen Burstyn is sort of ready to sing and dance at any opportunity, and she hits the road as well. So yeah, it was a really interesting time, and they were the objections were vague, just because in women's minds they still dreamed of the happy ending. I think in fact, I encountered this with some later films, An Unmarried Woman with Jill Clayburgh and the Gillian Anderson, Judy. My Brilliant Career, where these women were actually striking out on their own. And I was seeing these with feminist audiences, all of whom had said, no more happy endings, and they couldn't stand it that they didn't. And happily, how could Judy Davis couldn't she write and still be married to Wrench or Sam Neill and so forth? So there was a lot of ambivalence.
Yeah. You've said that 20th Century Women is sort of like the great unmade woman's film of the era, which is sort of what spawned you revisiting these films. Could you talk a bit about that, I guess, dig into that ambivalence, because it is I think it is a hard thing for people to, then even it was sort of a hard thing to sort of swallow, and something like Barbara Loden's character and Wanda.
I forgot to mention that, which I think is really, in a way, the great film of that time, because it's so complete. It's harrowing, but it also has a kind of integrity and authenticity. I think the others almost look like actors' exercises, especially the Cassavetes, I think. But Barbara Loden really knew that working class world, and it's so bleak. And she's not representative of anything. She's not a sort of feminist heroine. She's not even a typical victim. So it's almost sui generis. But there's something about 20th Century Women takes place in 1979, so it's a little bit after these films. And really, there's not, the cultural reference are really music, not movies, so you don't kind of know what Annette Bening has seen, if she's been inspired by any. But she did have dreams of becoming a pilot. She was a child of the Depression. She's very reserved, so it's all about this sort of little community that she has. She's a sort of hippie matriarch, and her son she's a single mother. The son barely knew his father. She's trying to bring him up in this changing world when our bodies, ourselves is on the table, and the Judy Blume is introduced teenagers to sex. And Jamie is sort of out of sorts with his good friend because she's more advanced than he is sexually. So it's sort of a comedy of manners about these changing mores and how people are dealing with them. And Annette Bening is very complicitous with Jamie in the beginning. In his youth, she lets him play hooky, and she has him sign a bank account and thinks of him as a real person. She doesn't want to treat him as a child, but then all of a sudden, he starts doing these horribly childish things and almost gets killed in a prank. He's playing with the group, and she's suddenly desperate. What do I do? So she brings in Greta Gerwig and Elle Fanning to help her, and Billy Crudup also as a kind of hippie live-in lodger carpenter. And so it sort of takes a group to bring up this kid. But she says she wants him to be a man, and he says, "What?" And definitions of manhood are changing. And he said, "Well, I'm not a man, Mother. I'm just a person." So it's this idea of gender, some kind of genderless future or fluidity of gender, but it's sort of right in the middle of it. And to me, I don't know, I seem to have responded to it more. I mean, a lot of people love it, but I didn't get the kind of traction that other films in 2016 did. And I think part of it is there's a kind of messiness, which I love, a kind of, I say even Renoir-esque, because you really do get every person's point of view. He's really Mike Mills is really interested in each character. So it's not just, and also it is about a mother's love for a son rather than her self-fulfillment. And that is not that sort of strikes some feminists, I guess, is putting the male at the center of the story, but I don't see it that way. I think at that moment in time, he is the only thing in the world to her. And then we see in this kind of time-traveling way that Mills does in and out of different eras, we see him later on and her later on, and really they do have careers independent of each other. But it's this kind of, I think it's something so, Jamie has been trying to understand women's orgasms. You know, he really is the sort of the ideal kind of sympathetic male that women were always looking for, and yet he gets completely demolished by his contemporary, the guys. I mean, all they want to do is get laid, and he's talking about women's orgasm. And, oh my God, what a creep! And his mother's sort of startled when this kind of conversation comes up. So it's just all these different. You feel the things changing so quickly. And I think it shows the messiness, but also it kind of projects a future of hope. I mean, Dorothea in the end gets her dream, and she gets a guy. I mean, her touchstone has been Casablanca. She talks about Humphrey Bogart, and that, I guess, is for women of her generation, that was the ideal, the man that sort of takes over, what is it? Ingrid Bergman says, you've got to think for both of us, and that's kind of the attitude of let the guy do the thinking, and now women are having to do the thinking, and you see thinking being done in the movie, I think.
And I guess you wrote a little bit about this in your piece, sort of talking about these neo-women's films. When you were living through it and talking about the age of ambivalence, I guess, what was that like? I mean, because again, you talk about seeing like an unmarried woman in the theater and having people sort of react badly to it. I guess, what was the sense in the air? Was it that, you know, these films were really touching on something, or were they just sort of like almost there but not quite? Or
well, both yeah. In a way, I think they were touching sore spots that I mean, we look back on it and we so sort of, it's very difficult to get into the context of an age that you've passed by. It's so hard to, even for me that went through it, to remember exactly what it felt like, because now careers just seem so almost automatic, and women are just so out there. But women were not out there. They weren't in public life. They weren't on that much on television. I mean, I think television came along even when movies were still being run by the boys' clubs in Hollywood. Women were making tremendous strides in both behind and in front of the camera in television. But this was a period of reading a lot, reading Germaine Greer and Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine. And Ms. Magazine, when I wrote From Reverence to Rape, they did not print an excerpt because they did not agree with my thesis that things had actually been better for women in the studio system. They thought, well, of course, because feminism is here, the theory of progress. And later on, I did write for them, and they did come to see what I was talking about. But I remember, so this is what the general culture was not on the same page with feminism. Joan Mellon and I did a stint for the Today Show, and we were taped talking. She had done a book on Bergman and women, and my book, I was saying how dismal the situation was. The 70s was really a low point. I mean, these films were outstanding simply because they had women at the center and great roles for actresses. How dismal it was. And then the tape was run. It was Barbara Walters who was watching the tape and then talking with her co-host. And she said, well, I just think they're paranoid, don't you? And then 3 or 4 years later, one of the film critics groups, I think it was a Film Critics Circle, somebody raised the idea of not even having a Best Actress award because just to show, this was mostly men, critics, just to show how outraged they were about this paucity of women's roles. But I said, that's not fair to the actresses. You can't just not give a role. But I mean, that was the degree, that was the sense of how women were being shortchanged at that time. And meanwhile, it was a sort of disconnect because they were making strides in politics and the professions. But at the same time, movies always a little behind the time and hadn't reflected it.
I guess to sort of rewind a little bit, you had mentioned this before on the podcast, this wonderful book about Barbara Loden's Wanda. Could you talk about the book and then also about the film?
Is this a new book?
New, yeah, it is pretty new. I wish I brought a copy with me, but I'd love to talk about Wanda, and I'd love to really advocate this book. It's by a French author named Nathalie Leger, and it's called Sweet for Barbara Loden. But first off, there's the film called Wanda, which is from 1970, and it's the only film directed by the actress Barbara Loden, who also starred in the film and wrote it. And she based it on a newspaper article from the 60s about a woman who was arrested for attempting to rob a bank and had the sad kind of audacity to actually thank the judge at her sentencing for sentencing her for 20 years in prison. All this information, by the way, I've gotten from the book Sweet for Barbara Loden. Barbara Loden has said that she was inspired by that woman's hopelessness and that it was something that she recognized as being similar to her own, and that she said she wanted to make Wanda as a way of confirming her own existence. Now, the book, Sweet for Barbara Loden, started off as a short encyclopedia entry for a film encyclopedia, but then it turned into this obsessive research project and eventually became this interesting little short hybrid book, which is part film analysis, part personal essay, and also very describes the film in detail from start to finish intermittently throughout the book. Now, Nathalie Leger, the author, I like how she has said about Wanda, the film, that she sees it as an example of a woman attempting to tell her own story through that of another woman. And she really enriches the film, I think. She teases out its major themes, which I believe are passivity and loneliness. And those are both themes that apparently, upon the release of the film, some feminists took issue with and criticized the film, that they thought that the character of Wanda was too passive and that she reveled in her passivity and saw it as an anti-feminist film. But I would disagree with that. I mean, the way that I see the film is that you can figure out on your own the circumstances or the mental state that would lead a woman to feel passive, lonely, useless, hopeless, and that why she might commit irrational acts or things that could be seen as anti-feminist. I think also clearly the film on its own represents a push against that passivity too.
Yeah, exactly, as the film. Well, I think this is the problem when you try to see films through an ideological construct as positive or negative. We did a panel once, Eleanor Perry was on it, and I think Joan Hackett or somebody, and Betty Friedan was in the audience, and so somebody raised the point, why don't we have a rating system for how women are treated? This was right after, I think, Sam Peckinpah had done
Straw Dogs?
Straw Dogs, thanks. Which I actually just did not like at the time for feminist reasons, and I actually came to have a slightly different opinion of later. I mean, these things do really change over time, but this is the heat of feminism. But so the idea would be, I mean, I don't know that any studio would run this. Why would they? But we would have a rating system, W plus for a good positive image of women, and W minus, and then W minus minus for straw dogs or something. And so the first question is, first of all, how do you determine, I mean, positive or negative? Do you want to see women ideally as triumphant over their misfortunes, or do you want to see them more faithfully, realistically as victims of a patriarchal culture? But I think both, you can have both. I mean, you can have women who are triumphant and women who are victims, and women who are sort of completely apolitical, outside of politics, which I think Wanda is, and has to be judged completely on her own terms.
Yeah, and showing us at our worst is sometimes, feminist.
Exhilarating in some ways, I think.
Yeah. So I think if that system was actually to be implemented, it should be like times. So it's like from the start to like 35 minutes in, W plus. And then after that, it gets a little minus.
That's right.
If that's like a truly fair. But
this was sort of based on remember the Catholic, well, you don't remember, and I don't really remember either, even before my time, but the Catholic Legion of Decency used to do this. They would have forbidden films, and that's the first one everybody would go run to see, So if you had W minus, everybody would go waiting to see women trampled upon, face in the dirt.
Yeah, well, I mean, you bring this up in your piece, like the Bechdel test now. It's sort of like, but it's a more of a useful heuristic. And I even think that people who, I mean, even Alison Bechdel herself is like, well, this is not the only thing.
Not a rigid kind of thing. Yeah. But I do think it's funny, though, the idea of women having, I mean, it's like Thelma and Louise. What came, that was one of the few films of the female buddy film, and it was, and nothing much has come after. So you really don't very often, in this enlightened day, you don't get women talking to each other without a man being present, except maybe on some of the new comedy things that come up from the internet. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard because it's like I'm thinking of something like Frances Ha, where it's like this is very digging into a female friendship and like the complexities, and then how sometimes it's not nice. Like how female
I love the Greta Gerwig for this reason. She's always playing kind of, I mean, a lot of people don't like her for that reason, which I think is kind of, I mean, I think that's exciting that she could antagonize people that way, and be so real and so goofy and yet smart, goofy, all these things at once. I think she's just a very exciting actress.
But I think like the female buddy comedy genre, that does not necessarily exist.
It really doesn't. It doesn't.
Again, thinking that male is default, these default male-oriented genres structured in a certain way. It's like, well, what would it take to have like a female buddy comedy? Would you have to show that it is sometimes like female friendship is not nice, or would you just completely idealize it and then make it maybe less real than it actually could be? And it's always a hard.
It is, and they should show women being mean to each other, because they are. I've just had a few reviews that reminded me that the sisterhood is not always mutually loving. But
well, we have Broad City, that's the closest, and that's television, and it's a comedy. It's just Broad City. It's a comedy about two girls, two best friends.
I knew there was something that was on television.
TV. That's the closest we can get, but it still doesn't apply really to the buddy genre rules.
No. Yeah, I mean, I really love Broad City because it gets into like just how strange it can be with this like Alana's almost lesbian affection for
her
Abby,
friends,
and like how it's just like so blatant, and then other times it's more coded. It's I love that show. I say no to girls always and ever. But we should go back to the early 70s again. Wanda, that's sort of like the refusenik housewife genre. Another film that you wrote about really interestingly was Diary of a Mad Housewife. Obviously, it's in the title.
It is.
I remember watching this on Bravo after school, back when Bravo would show movies and like arts instead of whatever hellish reality shows it shows now.
Yeah.
But it would be great to hear you talk about it, and specifically like, the Frank Langella character and
Richard Benjamin and Carrie Snodgrass.
Yeah.
And one that I wanted to write about, because it's of that era, is Puzzle of a Downfall Child, the Faye
Yes.
Dunaway. That is absolutely not, I don't think it's on video cassette or DVD.
It's on YouTube.
Oh, is
I
it?
watched it on YouTube.
Oh,
yeah.
that's great.
Somebody uploaded.
I didn't think of that. I should have. Diary of a Mad Housewife was written by a woman, and I think the problem was that it was Richard Benjamin's character was so abrasive. He was so supercilious that people got sick of him. But it looks much more interesting today. And this actually is a very expressive of what women were going through then, because she is a housewife. It's not the career that calls, but it's an affair. And Frank Langella is sort of divinely androgynous at that point, and gorgeous, and also supercilious. Both of the men are just. There should be another genre, the film about the arrogant male, because they run through all of these films. All of the Mad Housewife films have arrogant males in them. So she starts his affair, and they're not going to let it. It's very much kind of the era of the zipless fuck. Nobody's going to feel anything, and gradually feelings do creep in, and his defense is to sort of make fun of her gentility, and he says, I can tell you went to. I mean, he sort of lists all the things about her that are true, and the women's college she went to. He just has her pegged, but you feel with her, and Carrie Snodgrass is terrific in this, that she's a lot more than that. And she's got a lot of feeling. And I was thinking of the song, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow? Because women were trying to be independent, and yet they still wanted that assurance. And it's what we're reading about it now in Sex in College, is that women do want something a little different. And they're right to want that, I think. We shouldn't let men get away with this.
Yeah, no. But speaking of Puzzle of a Downfall Child, I thought, because Carol Eastman was the screenwriter of that, and she was also the screenwriter of one of the great road trip males, Five Missing Pieces.
Yeah, but she got a lot of women into it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
And I think the women are obviously Eileen I can't say her name, Katskalanides. Well, the hitchhikers they pick up are obviously like such a wonderful, like what happens over the course of giving them a lift is so incredible. Obviously, like the restaurant scene, and Karen Black's character, the sister, like all of the women in that film are very utterly fascinating unto themselves. For people who haven't seen Puzzle of a Downfall Child, sort of the unnamed, wandering, unsettledness of Jack Nicholson's character is very present in Puzzle of a Downfall Child. That sort of Faye Dunaway plays this star model. This is before the superstar or the supermodel. She was just a star model who slowly rises through the ranks, and it was based on an actual model who had cracked up's experience. Like it was this really long rambling tape, and that's the sort of the framing device of the movie. But as the film goes on and you see her rise and rise, you also come to realize that she's an unreliable narrator, and that there are parts of, either because she suffered some trauma that she can't really open up about. She keeps alluding to this, an affair she had when she was 15 or 16 with this older rich man. And there's a love scene in the film where she goes into it wanting to have sex with this guy. And then as they're actually having sex, there's a flash and she remembers this older man cornering her in a field, and like she's like, no, I don't want to, but she still finishes having sex with this guy. And it's like such a harrowing and like very real depiction of like how
traumatized by sex.
How sometimes how sex can really go from being a consensual thing to a not consensual thing. And it's just like I can't even imagine a film now putting something like that in.
And it's also how your whole history is with you every time, and it's not just this moment with this person.
Yes.
I think that's great.
Faye Dunaway is like so amazing in it. She's totally right to call up the people on Game of Thrones and give them acting notes after each episode, which I rumor I've heard, not necessarily true. But she's like she's like so fantastic.
The people wrote that it was very close to her too. That she really was having a difficult time at that point. Yeah, a little bit of a crack up.
I mean, you can even see it in like the contours of her face and like how like she's glamorous, but she does look like run down. It's kind of but it's not overdone. Yeah, but
that's such a hard thing. I love to talk about glamour because the one thing in Wanda is compared to her, the rest all look tarted up. She's so gritty and real and unglamorized. And even her hair, which is beautiful, is still kind of she can't control it. It's all out of control. Whereas all the other women usually, and it's so understandable. This is one of the things I found fascinating in 20th century women, is how totally unglamorous Annette Bening allows herself to be. I think she looks beautiful. A friend of mine who's not a dummy said, well, couldn't she get dressed up just once, when she goes out to the rave? But that is such a hard question. And all of these films, and Shirley Knight in The Rain People, she looks pretty battered. She's been crossing the United States here and there and bumming around, but her hair is always perfectly blow-dried. And you understand this because glamour is part of the stock and trade of women. How do you deal with this? I don't know. I just think it's a constant question. The fact that, for all of the strides we've made, there's still that huge inequity, the double standard of aging. Right. Men still are seen as more attractive, although I think they're being called on it more often now. Harrison, they have these geezer, make fun of themselves as geezers, even as they're acting heroes and saving women,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, the other film that you were going to bring up.
Slightly veering a little bit, but also going into later in the decade too. I wanted to talk about the film Girlfriends as a dramedy, kind of more lighter film from '78, and it was directed by Claudia Weil, and it stars Melanie Mayron, this fantastic actress, as this woman Susan, who's a budding photographer in New York City. And she has a very close relationship with her best friend and roommate, which is sort of interrupted when her roommate gets married and moves upstate. And it's very much like Frances Ha in that respect, the plot. Eli Wallach is in it. He's kind of the only name in the film. He plays her sometimes employer, sometimes love interest / rabbi. And the boyfriends are played by comedians. There's Bob Balaban, who plays his role fairly straight, and Christopher Guest, who becomes Susan's boyfriend. So the men in the film are kind of slight name. At the time, I think Bob Balaban was in Close Encounters, and Christopher Guest was on Saturday Night Live, I think. But the women were, for the most part, unknowns, but they're just fantastic. Every single one of them is fantastic, especially Melanie Mayron's performance, I think, is just so compelling, and she's self-deprecating and very funny, and she's very charming still, and maybe one might say quirky, but still being identifiable and realistic and very naturalistic, which makes me think it's a great counterpoint to some of our contemporary independent films, where I think we have a lot of female characters in these dramedies, the more lighthearted ones, that are kind of quirky or charming to the point of being quaint. Right. I think a contemporary example might be Patterson, which is a film that I still loved, actually. I still love that film, but I had to set her character aside. Sometimes I had to set her aside. She was like a twist of cotton candy, She was lovely, but she kind of made me sick a little bit.
Interesting, yeah.
And I think that happens a lot in the more lighthearted contemporary films. And I think Girlfriends and also about Girlfriends, it would score very highly on the Bechdel test, I think, in the W exam. It has several scenes of women talking to each other about their own creative work. And scenes of women getting each other jobs and just in general supporting each other. It's very nice.
You brought that up. I have to take another look at it because there were a bunch of women directors at the time that were making small films, and sometimes they would be shown at the Whitney, or there were actually women's film festivals that they would be shown at. And so that's gone now. I think that was a real kind of filmmaking sisterhood.
I read that it was just filmed over the course of a year, like a few days here and there, because it was such a small film. Yeah. And I think that leads to it appearing very naturalistic. Because how else are you going to have any continuity, unless you just keep it how
Well, and the ending is like so sad and kind of harrowing in a way. Like,
how does it end?
She goes to see her friend upstate.
Yes.
And her friend has just again, just like Frances Ha, her friend had an abortion.
Yeah.
And they're just kind of consoling each other, and it's like the friendship kind of picks back up again after being down for a bit, and they get drunk, I think.
Yeah.
But then still the husband kind of comes home, and Melanie Mayron's character is like, okay, I've got to go home now, you know? So it still reverts back to the husband and wife kind of have the primacy of the relationship.
Yeah.
How do you think the relationships among the females are in Girls?
Oh God, I don't watch that show.
Yeah.
Well,
Did you ever?
I don't
watched the
watch
first
it
episode.
either, but I felt I watched it at first, and
that's what I did.
and I did admire her for kind of putting herself out there and showing herself to be a flawed character. I mean, people criticize her for that and make fun of her and think she's insufferable, but she knows it too. I mean, she's directing and writing these things. She knows she's insufferable. And she experiences more criticism than, say, I really don't think this is a stretch, but at the time, like Louis C.K., I think was doing something similar in a way, you know, just showing himself to be a flawed human being and kind of putting himself out there. And
now
he was compared to Woody Allen.
When in reality he's ripping off David Lynch.
Yeah,
Also I think the other thing I would say about Louis is that as the seasons have gone on and he's gotten more insufferable, I have less patience for that show, and now I don't watch it at all.
I know,
I just
me neither, but
I just can't.
Yeah, just the
I know what
distinction.
you mean.
Yeah, between women and men showing themselves to be flawed characters, and the type of criticism that they receive is different.
Yeah.
It is.
And I would actually say, to return to Carol Eastman before I switched topics, that she was an incredibly neurotic person. And it's funny to think that a cruel, unanswerable thought experiment, what if she was a man and was that neurotic? Would it be a thing of like, oh, it's like a Woody Allen sort of thing, it's charming? Or would it just be like, no, this is literally getting in the way of working? Anyway, another female director who wrote a significant amount, who had incredibly flawed characters, but I think the distinction is she loved them, was Elaine May.
Yeah,
And like just thinking about, you know, the Heartbreak Kid, like this is an utterly unredeemable, terrible person, and yet the sense, or even like a
You mean
New
the Grodin
Leaf.
character or the Jeannie Berlin character?
I think both of them.
Yeah.
I mean, both of them. Like, just like I can never get over that scene where, you know, they're on their honeymoon and like they fail. They have this, and then he's like, "Where are you going?" Pee-pee. And just getting like how perfect that moment is, like, and just you understand why he absolutely has to get away from this woman, and yet you feel horrible for her. Like it's really like the way that it's made, it really takes you through all of these different perspectives. And then I have no problem saying it's better than The Graduate. I don't care. Fight me. But like just the repetition of Close to You, and how after a certain point it's like becomes ironic and then like very cutting and sad, and like I don't know, I think it's very masterful in how it takes you through these different subjectivities and like affinities for these characters.
Interesting, because that's another one that looks different today. At the time, women did criticize it because it felt like she was just trashing her daughter. It just felt like this giant humiliation for Jeannie Berlin, and compared to Sybil Shepherd. I mean, you know, it's just, and in a way, I mean, I still think it does humiliate her, but the Grodin character is just a horse's ass, but he's still cute, though.
Right.
That's the trouble. I mean, she's not cute. She really is squirm-inducing.
Yeah.
But I mean, that was also some in Cassavetes and other directors at the time, a kind of the cinema of discomfort, you could call it. And Cassavetes loved to make you uncomfortable. But the discomfort in The Heartbreak Kid, I think you have to see it a couple of times before you kind of get the whole picture. Because as you say, it changes gears and it reflects different people in different ways. And I think the man is kind of the center simply because it's a man. The triangle he's at the apex of that. But in the end, he's made this bargain he's a loser. I mean, yeah.
And that he's just surrounded by children at the end because that's what he is. Like one of the great pioneers of the man-child genre was Ishtar, which is obviously much later. But, you know, even something like A New Leaf, where again, it's like the character she plays is just so whiny and nebbish and terrible. And yet she wins. And obviously Walter Matthau's character is such a ass and terrible. Like he's rich and terrible. Like there's nothing redeemable about him. And yet you really do come to sort of an understand. It's not totally implausible at the end what happens. Like it is like I went somewhere and I didn't realize I was being taken somewhere, and now I'm here and I'm fine with it.
Well, the trouble is that I think this is the narrower latitude that women have, because it's a really difficult thing to bring off, to have a ridiculous woman, and even in these shows we're talking about, and girls like that, because first of all, men are ready to just dismiss any woman who doesn't meet their expectations.
Exactly.
So already you're facing that, whereas they're much more indulgent. Women and men are more indulgent and tolerant of male misbehavior. Mm-hmm. So you just got that barrier that's always there. So I really give full credit to the women who've broken this barrier. And I think the more it happens, the more acceptable it is. Like with Annette Bening, I think if we could see more women who are just sort of weather-beaten and that's who they are, and who are so obviously authentic, then we can accept it. But there is this tendency to want women a little more plastic and glamorous.
Yeah. Well, because, I mean, in your piece, you talk about how, like, the struggles that were present in, these early 70s films come in the 80s to be, like, played out in these vastly different situations where it's like, it's like this very confident career woman is having this crisis. And it's like, or like these very beautiful women or very glamorized women are just like, it's sort of, the context shifts in a way that makes the internal working through of like what feminism actually really means less feminist somehow, or just like not as sincere.
The have it all syndrome. I think you wrote about. Yeah.
Well, like also they're so easy to, and this is true in all Hollywood movies too. The professional woman is like right one step short of caricature already. Mm-hmm. I was looking at something when I was doing the Annette Bening piece at American Beauty, and her character there, she got an Academy Award nomination as support, I think, but her housewife character is so awful. Everyone else in that picture misbehaves, but they're all forgiven. You have this empathy for every single other person, and she's just a shrieking parody of womanhood the whole way through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that movie doesn't age too well.
No.
For a lot of reasons.
And it's very unusual because she's always, the thing about her is this tremendous humanity I think she has. And for her not to be able to express that is something bad.
Are there any other films that we didn't get to? Well, I think what you said about Woman Under the Influence, speaking of a shrieking housewife.
Yeah,
I think what you said about A Woman Under the Influence is really excellent, because I've always had a problem with that film.
Have you? Uh-huh.
And I could never put my finger on why, as opposed to something like Minnie and Moskowitz, which is like,
I know.
I love that movie so much, and it's so touching.
Yeah, I do too.
But it's just like, but Women Under the Influence, it's just like, I could never fully, like, it's like one of those things where it's like, is it like my taste buds are broken, or like what is wrong with me?
I agree. I'm so glad to hear you say it, because I've had the same problem, and men seem to like it enormously. I'm not exactly sure. I think it's why they like Isabelle Huppert. Well, I like her too, but won't get into that. But yeah, I think it's because she embodies this anti-bourgeois impulse of Cassavetes to just make everybody so uncomfortable. And if we are uncomfortable, then that makes us part of the terrible family, the repressive family. It's very actor studio-ish realism. You don't have the husband. Peter Falk is the construction worker husband, and he's got all these construction worker friends. It's a little odd. I mean, they're living a sort of middle-class life or lower middle-class life. The mother, they're real mothers, I think. Jenna Rowland's mother, anyway, it's a mother in it. And she just cracks up. One day she's with the children, and then she's suddenly babbling, and they send her off to an institution. And Peter Falk is the loving husband and he's meant to be incredibly sympathetic, although I find him, I just don't get that marriage exactly. So he has his buddies over, and then she comes in, and I guess the climactic scene is when they bring her home from the loony bin and hope to embrace her, bring her back to the family. But they've staged this party, which is all wrong. Already this is Cassie. Wouldn't you allow her to come in a little privately? No. They have this sort of showdown in the living room. It's very theatrical. In fact, it was written first as a play, and Jenna Rowland said, "I can't do it. It's just too demanding to do." It's like a monologue, this incredible breakdown that she has. So each person plays a kind of preordained role of conventional society. And I think a lot of other things that were going on at this time were Herbert Marcuse and also the British the British psychiatrist R.D. Laing, who said that he felt that society was this sense of anarchy is justified or rebellion is justified because society itself is insane. Insanity is the only way to respond to an insane society. And this became the kind of, anthem of a lot of these movies. And I think particularly this is true in the Cassavetes. It almost doesn't have to have a kind of coherent substratum. It's just the idea of her insanity as a reaction to this insanely repressive society. But I think there's never any opening to me for genuine feeling. I mean, she goes to a bar, and she's very much his kind of actor anyway, which means extreme and histrionic and the sort of seething. And it can work wonderfully. But I agree. I think Minnie and Moskowitz is the best because it's contained in some way, and it has a more kind of direct human contact with the audience, I think. Yeah.
And just like the relationship, what she goes through feels like way more representative of a woman's experience.
Yeah.
Where it's like she goes on that terrible date with the older guy, and it's like how that plays out and like the rhythms of that. It's like, that's a real thing as opposed to you say like this big weird party.
Yeah.
It's sort of like this set piece
It's
thing.
incredibly stagey.
Yeah.
I think that's when you compare these to something like Wanda. I mean, you wouldn't want every film like Wanda, but still, there's a kind of, you feel that Barbara Loden is so close to that character she's playing that, you can hardly see the air between them. She is playing it. She's not that. The fact that she makes the films means the film means she's not a victim anymore. And of course, everybody thought that Elia Kazan was really the one that made it and that he was taking all the credit. I think it sort of bothered him in a way that she had done this thing on her own and so beautifully and successfully. But it is interesting about A Woman Under the Influence, and I'm not sure why it is. But for some critics, Cassavetes can do no wrong just because he is so over the top and adventurous and all of that. But I find that for me, Cassavetes goes a long way, which is one reason that the Elaine May film I didn't love, just because there's something, I think Cassavetes was wonderful in Rosemary's Baby because there's something really scary about him, and he can do that. But of course, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to do his own thing, and that became a bit too much for me sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, also it's good to keep in mind that like Mikey and Nikki was not actually finished. Like, it was taken away from her, and the studio sort of just released this. Because it's like very... Elaine May, I saw her speak once after a screening of Ishtar, and she was talking about how like when she did her first film, she didn't realize that you needed to do coverage. And so sort of like these basic things. And then it's like, but then she was someone who went on to be this like ultra perfectionist who would like want 100 takes of something. And then that, that's okay for Stanley Kubrick, but it's not okay for Elaine May. So like these films get taken away from her and like made out to be these gigantic disasters when in reality, Ishtar's still pretty damn funny and did pretty well at the box office.
Wait, is there a version of it now that's closer to what you wanted, or
of Mikey and Nikki?
Oh, Mikey and Nikki. Yeah.
I don't think so, because I just think it just was it was during the shooting, and it was never like.
Yeah. No, but I have to revisit both of those. I think because you do get swayed by the critical temper of the time, and they are a mess, but. In some ways, but Cassavetes got complete credit for his mess, and she didn't,
Exactly.
But I guess she did. She was working with big money with Ishtar, so that was a problem, I guess.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we have to close. We have to sort of wrap up. But before we do, we always go around and say a film that we saw recently that we liked. I can go first to give you some time to think.
No, I've got one too. So.
Okay. So I rewatched Reds recently.
Well, you mentioned Elaine May having something to do with it. I never heard that.
Apparently she like helped write, because this is the other thing about Elaine May is she's sort of notorious for like working on things and then not
getting any credit.
Or not announcing herself as like having worked on it, or sort of like,
you mean in later life, not even taking credit later. Yeah.
And so she did some work on Reds, which is this gigantic sprawling historical epic about communists with also this like really amazing, like Henry Miller, for instance, died the year after. There's these amazing one-on-one interviews with people who were involved in the New York scene, who were communists, socialists, free-thinking, super leftists. But yeah, it's just like Warren. I think it's probably my favorite Diane Keaton performance, where she's not playing like this weird airhead.
Goofy, yeah.
She's like not goofy at all. She's just like very like, she knows exactly what she wants, and then when she doesn't know what she wants, she's kind of terrified, but she makes it through it. Like it's a really
also
fantastic.
She's a little bit cryptic. She's not always telling you what she wants.
Yeah.
The film is very subtle. I watched it because you mentioned it, and I was blown away by it. I really think it's great. I think those witnesses are fantastic. I think Rebecca West was one. There are all sorts of people that they really conjure up that period of sort of bohemian left-wing village. But in the beginning, when you see Diane, I was sort of, wait a minute now, because you just so expect her to fall into that. She has such a strong personality that it's almost hard to see her as a character.
Right.
But she absolutely does. And the triangle is so powerful with her and Eugene O'Neill, played by Jack Nicholson. I think it's some of his best work.
Yes.
I mean, all of them are in the service of the film in some way. Even Warren Beatty. I mean, he's the star, but he also is. And I just think it's, I mean, the ending, I just dissolved.
Yeah.
But you don't know which way she's going to, and you always feel that pull to O'Neill. Usually, you give up one guy and you go for the other, but the truth is that triangles stay with you, and you may renounce one person officially, but that person's still there with you, and you feel that with that. I was amazed at how rich and subtle it is.
Yeah. I mean, it's super long, so it can sort of get into these little like weird places, and like, again, it's like I don't know, and no one can really know exactly what, except for her, what Elaine May added to the script, but there are just these little moments of comedy or lightness or just goofiness, or even like Warren Beatty is called up before the head of the Communist Party in Russia, and it's like a really dire time, and they're basically telling him, no, you cannot leave the country. And this guy is eating an onion and some lemon. And it's like, I think that's Elaine May. I want to believe that's Elaine May. And then he's like offering it to Warren Beatty, and Warren Beatty's like, no. And he's like, lemons are very hard to come by.
That's great. And wouldn't it be fun to know what she had done?
Oh,
Gosh,
absolutely.
I don't know if that's ever going to be possible.
Yeah. It's also just like amazing on an epic scale. But
It is. And even looking at it, I was looking at it on my iPad, it still looks great.
Oh, yeah.
That's the first time two people have watched the same film for the podcast.
It's
it worked out very well.
She brought it,
It's true.
Yeah.
Well, totally different. I watched Adam Egoyan's Exotica, which I've wanted to see for a really long time. And years ago, I used to get it mixed up with Jade. Because I think back in the VHS days, the video art, the cover art was very similar.
I remember this.
So I used to get those two mixed up, but I've wanted to see Exotica for a long time, and I watched it on YouTube because that's starting to happen now. I think films that are out of print.
And they look okay?
This looked very good. Then there was also a different copy on there that looked terrible, but
what made
the one
you
that I
look
watched. I just having a conversation with someone and Exotica, and I always wanted to see that. And they said, let's just see if it's on YouTube. And I thought, no way. Yeah. And it was in its entirety. And it was everything, I'd hoped it would be. I don't want to just talk about it too much because a lot of information is doled out kind of out of order, in the film. But it's about a strip club. It's also not really about a strip club. And also there are parallel stories of the strip club and a man who works in an exotic pet store. So there are themes of exotica in the film. And I enjoyed it very much.
What year was that?
94. Very much a film of 1994.
People are always complaining. The thesis of this book that I wrote an essay for is about the golden age, the late 60s and early 70s. But, I don't believe in golden ages. I think every age, there's so many things that we can see now that are just fantastic. And, I mean, Hollywood, who cares? That's all the data and statistics about how many women directors there are, how many women on the screen, or how much they say. Doesn't give a true picture because, first of all, most of Hollywood is franchise pictures and action pictures, and who wants to? We don't even go to most of these things.
Who cares?
Yeah, who cares? Who cares? And what you're seeing when you see women, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the amount of verbiage that they spew out. So I just think you have to sort of look at it with an openness and be ready for whatever comes our way. And I think both of you obviously are. if I may say so. Yeah.
Hooray. Well, thank you both for coming. This was so much fun.
Oh, it was fun.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
You've been listening to the Film Comment Podcast, produced by Violet Lucca and Nicholas Rapold, and edited by Michael Odmark. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Film Comment is a bi-monthly magazine published by the Film Society of Lincoln Center. Since 1962, Film Comment has featured in-depth reviews, critical analysis, and feature coverage of mainstream, art house, and avant-garde filmmaking from around the world. Visit us online at filmcomment.com/subscribe to purchase a digital or print subscription to the magazine. Film Comment, at the heart of film culture for over 50 years.